today to introduce our speaker, our fearless leader, Pete Marra. I know, seriously. I don't even know. Phenomenal Dean of Earth Commons Institute. He has been here at Georgetown since 2019. I'm sure no challenges whatsoever with starting in 2019, right before a global pandemic, and somehow brought us through to this fantastic new space we're in now. Before that, he was at the Smithsonian as the director of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center for 20 years. Really just an absolute pioneer about, not just ornithology and the risks facing birds today, but also thinking globally about how birds move, where they go, and why we can't really think of a species as just being in one spot. And I'm so excited today to hear more about his incredible research and efforts to conserve global bird populations. So with that, Pete, please take the floor.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks all for coming. I do like to take questions during my talk, so just feel free to shout at me or raise a hand. If I don't see it, just say, Pete, I got a question for you. I'm totally happy to do that. I started off this morning after I rode my bike in from home at the reflecting pool. Sitting in that reflecting pool this morning. Did you go see it, Amy?
I just did.
You just did, yeah. So there's a red phalarope, which is a seabird that's in the reflecting pool. It's about this big, and it's feeding on the Newston.
Wow.
In the reflecting pool, spinning around, kicking things around. It's a really cool little migratory bird. And I bring that up because it was a perfect intro into. Is it not working?
In the meantime, Pete, can you tell us what that bird is?
This is it's a species of cormorant, probably double-crested cormorant.
Got some goals.
Can you tell us where this is taken?
I don't know. I didn't take that picture. I can tell you where this is. But as we walk around every day, as we go to sleep in the evenings, as we shop, as we work, things are moving on the planet all the time. Organisms are moving on the planet. Every one of those lines is an animal or some sort of a bird or a bat or you name it. It is traversing across the planet. In certain times of year, you have more than at other times of the year, depending if you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. But animals are moving all the time in response to energy, for the most part. But it's amazing. Most people aren't aware of this. Last night, for example, there was a mass migration that happened. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of birds were flying overnight. They're nocturnal migrants. And that red phalarope that was in that pond and the common yellowthroat that I saw not far from the Capitol building and the Connecticut warbler that somebody saw just two days ago, these really rare birds were dropping into any sort of stopover habitat they could find to fatten up and continue on their way south to get to their wintering grounds. But this movement, these movement dynamics are happening, and we're just pretty much oblivious to this for the most part because we can't track these things. Most people aren't aware of this movement that happens on the planet. But it's quite amazing. And these represent cycles, and cycles are pervasive on our planet. They're pervasive across all physical and biological systems. And these are cycles that are driven by the spinning of a tilted Earth around the sun. That's set thousands and trillions of cycles from the cellular to the biochemical to the individual animal or the population on this planet. And most of us are completely oblivious to how cycles are driving everything that we see. The one cycle that many of us are aware of is seasonal cycles. We're aware of day-night cycles, but seasonal cycles are one of the cycles that most of us are aware of when we think about spring, moving into summer, moving into fall, and then moving into winter. And this cycle in particular drives a lot of these mass movements of animals and also cycles that we see in plants. Those aren't migratory, but some people would argue that plants actually are migratory. And it's a really dominant phenomenon that it's just a critical thing that drives a lot of biological processes on the planet that I've just always been amazed by. And you see these sorts of cycles, these migration cycles, which is basically a movement, a directional movement to and from. It usually involves a reproductive period, and then it involves a non-breeding period. And we see cycles in insects. We see it in all kinds of fish, salmon. We see it in eels. There's so many fish that are migratory. We see it in sea turtles that actually go off into a near shore area and then come onto islands to lay eggs and go off again, they come back again. It's an amazing cycle, usually migratory, and there's lots of snakes that go to and from hibernacula, rattlesnakes, garter snakes, lots of species of the snakes that are well-known migratory species. Pelicans and lots of birds. Birds are probably where I think migration is known the best. I'm certainly biased there. And of course, whales. And yes, this dude is an idiot. That's not the one that was swallowed up by a humpback whale, but humpback whales have occasionally taken the occasional silly kayaker. But whales are another wonderful species that are known to be migratory. In fact, the largest animal that's ever lived on the planet, the blue whale, is a migratory animal, responding to changes in energy on the planet. It's a fundamental movement. It's a fundamental aspect of the biology of animals. Wildebeests are another big migratory species that people have become familiar with, and there's a lot of other species that are known to be migratory in Africa. These are Mexican free-tailed bats. This is a roost site that I went to. It's actually a nesting site outside San Antonio several years ago. And there's I think several hundred thousand that nest, and every night they come out and they go out to their foraging areas. You can see the line of bats that go out. They forage, they come back in, they lactate, they feed their young inside the cave. They're there for several months and they migrate away again. So there's a diurnal movement, and then there's a seasonal movement that these bats are known for. There's several places in Texas where you can go see these. I highly recommend seeing these bats outside Austin, outside San Antonio. They're all quite spectacular. But I do think it's bird migration where people think about migration. And this is a little video we put together of a project that we're working on with black-bellied plovers. This is Adelman Harrison. I hired her several years ago to run something called the Migratory Connectivity Project. She's just caught a black-bellied plover. It's a shorebird. She's on the North Slope of Alaska. She's going to attach a 5-gram satellite tag onto the back of the bird. This tag will transmit its location to satellites and then come back down to Earth. I'll be sitting through a glass of wine watching the Colville River Delta. That's the breeding territory of the plover. Then the breeding ends and the bird begins to move. Fattening up, starting to make some bigger moves. This is around September. In one big jump. Fattening up again. It's a stopover area. Then it makes another jump. We can learn about its speed. We can learn about how long it takes to stop over to fatten up. It makes this big jump across the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, the Gulf of Mexico. Across Central America into Peru, where it spends the majority of non-breeding period. Dodging jaguars, and a variety of other predators trying to get to it. It's there till March, then makes another migration back across Central America to Manitoba and Texas, where it fattens up again, getting ready for the breeding season. Big jump back up, probably still slow on the road. The exact same spot. That was just one bird. There are thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of these same birds doing the same thing, just this species. Look at the variation there. They not only went to Peru, they went to Brazil, they went to Panama, Cuba, Texas, all over the place. The diversity of that single species is just wonderful. North America, most bird species are in fact migratory. There are roughly between 750 and 800 species of regular occurring birds in North America. And about 75% of these are thought to be migratory species. That means, again, they move back and forth across seasons. These are actually starlings, and that's your classic murmuration, which is a remarkable ballet in the air. If you ever have a chance to see a murmuration, I highly recommend you see it. It's just a remarkable natural phenomenon. Let's see if this works for me standing here. So these species of migratory birds represent all types of birds, from ducks to tanagers, to warblers, to flycatchers, to sparrows, to orioles, to terns, to hawks. These are all examples of migratory species. The problem is that species like this, the cerulean warbler, that also has a remarkable migration, and we've recently just started to track where these birds go. We know their overall ranges. We know the breeding range, and we know roughly the non-breeding range or the wintering range, but we haven't for the longest time known where exact populations, say the birds that breed here, winter, versus the birds that in the same species that might be breeding in, say, Ohio or California, where they winter. That's called migratory connectivity. And it's turned out, this is something that I've really moved forward on and led this development of. We've not known much about that, but that's critical for various aspects of understanding their biology and understanding their conservation. And this cerulean warbler, and we can talk about that later in the question period if you like. This isn't working, unfortunately, Priscilla. But if you look at that the red line, we've just recently discovered where those western cerulean warblers actually spend the non-breeding season versus the eastern ones. The fact that they don't overlap and they segregate fairly discreetly like that. And so that's really important to understand various aspects of their biology, as I mentioned. The problem is that many of these species are declining. So cerulean warbler in the past 50 years has declined by 75%. That means 3 out of 4 cerulean warblers are now gone from the planet. Rusty blackbird, just a remarkable bird. It looks kind of dull, but if you look at the subtle browns and blacks, you really kind of get into it. Maybe that's just me, but I think they're a remarkable looking bird. There are 2 different populations, discrete populations of rusty blackbirds. There is this western population that breeds all the way up in the boreal forests of Alaska, and they kind of move all the way down to the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. Then there's an eastern population that's up in the boreal habitats of Maine, and then come down the East Coast and spend the winters down in South Carolina and the lowlands of Georgia and that area, and maybe a little bit further south. And we can track these birds with various tracking devices. That's another talk. I'm not going to talk about the details of that. I'm really going to focus on conservation today. But because of the emergence of a lot of smaller and smaller tracking devices that I've been involved with developing and deploying, we've been able to track smaller and smaller birds to really understand where they go, how they get there. And that video that I showed you was an example of us really taking an emergent technology and deploying it on a bird that we weren't able to really track before. Now we can track. But what we're starting to discover is species like the rusty blackbird, just like the cerulean warbler, are disappearing before our very eyes. And so the rusty blackbird is now declined by 90%. 9 out of 10 birds are now gone off the planet. Red knot, another remarkable species. It is a shorebird. It is a bird that some of the populations actually migrate from the high Arctic, where they breed, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Some will stop along the way, but it's just a wonderful shorebird. And if you have the opportunity, not too far from here, 2 hours away on the Delaware Bay, in May, they actually synchronize their stopover with horseshoe crab spawning. And so the horseshoe crab spawning is this, so they just start spewing these eggs into the Delaware Bay, and shorebirds have timed their migration to take advantage of these little fat pockets of lipids, and they just fatten up, and it allows them to make the next big jump all the way up to the high Arctic. Problem is we've been removing horseshoe crabs from that system for a variety of other things. Permanent removal. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And we think that that's one of the main drivers of the decline in red knots. And so we've seen a 95% decline in red knots. It's just a horrible, horrible situation. So we're losing the epic migrations of birds. And that's not just here. I'm actually working on a review paper now for Nature on the global migration situation, the status, trends, and conservation of migration on the Earth. And we're seeing these same sorts of patterns across the entire globe. And we just have the best data in North America and Europe compared to the global South, where we don't have much monitoring data like we have here. And this is not new. We've been through this before. We've been through this in multiple times, going back to the early 1900s. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson. Priscilla. I'll just use this. Oh, something's not working. History does repeat itself. So we saw this in mid 1800s with the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon, of course, is extinct, but in the mid 1800s, it was one of the most abundant birds in North America. In fact, it was feeding a large enslaved population. It was key protein that was used in the Civil War because there were so many and they were so abundant. There's stories of where people just would look at, passenger pigeon, big flocks of passenger pigeons just flying across the sky, but we over-harvested them. And they eventually went extinct. In 1914, the last passenger pigeon died at the Cincinnati Zoo. The same almost happened to several species of herons and egrets. We can see herons and egrets. We just took out a group of folks from master students to the Kenilworth Gardens, and we saw great egrets. That's the bird right in the middle. Great egrets during their breeding season, and several other species of egrets and herons develop these remarkable phyloplumes. You can see them right in the middle there. These are modified feathers that are meant for mate attraction. And it turns out at that time, they were also very attractive for fashion. So they were over hunting herons and egrets, and they were using these for hats and clothing. And it was about that time when Teddy Roosevelt was very interested in conservation, and he actually created something called the Neotropical Migratory Bird Act. And it was a first piece of legislation that really was put in place to protect birds, and they came back. That's the one good piece of news here. And something that we really emphasize is that nature is ridiculously resilient. And once given the chance, they typically respond. But that wasn't the last bird crisis. There was another bird crisis just after this, and this was with DDT. Most of you are probably familiar with the story of DDT, but I'm going to bore you again with it because it's one of my favorite stories, success stories. People started to see a lot of dead birds in the 1940s, 1950s, robins, a variety of places and other species. And they were all dying because of our use of DDT. That was primarily an insecticide that was being sprayed primarily for insects. But we started to notice that populations of species like the peregrine falcon, this one here, bald eagles, brown pelicans, ospreys, were sitting on scrambled eggs. Because DDT was actually somehow breaking up, and I don't remember the details of the chemistry, it was impacting the ability of birds to deposit calcium to create eggs. And so we started to see this massive declines in several species of these raptors, and it started to cause real problems. Thankfully, there was a person who came along by the name of Rachel Carson, and Rachel Carson probably wrote what I think is one of the most important books, eco books, environmental books on the planet. And so this really kicked into gear a lot of activism. It was the first real effort to challenge corporate America on what they were doing to our environment. And it impacted so many different things. It kicked into gear what's known as the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, which actually ultimately saved all those species I just mentioned and many, many more. No species went extinct due to DDT, and they've all come back. I went on the Hilltop campus, I used to see a bald eagle almost every day. I'd see a peregrine falcon once a week. I probably will see them here too. But it also created the Environmental Protection Agency. It had all sorts of other major impacts. Earth Day was started after this whole thing happened. It was amazing how this crisis ended up creating so many positive things. So whenever I go and hear of a new environmental crisis, my first response is, how do we turn this for good? How do we create something that we really need? And we should be thinking about the current crisis we're in broadly, about what the turnaround looks like in this case. And so at that same time, it was interesting because Rachel Carson used to spend a lot of time at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, which is not far from here in Laurel, Maryland. It's also another place that's disappearing, unfortunately. But for years, it held a remarkable collection of brilliant scholars and scientists who all thought about various aspects of species biology and environmental science. This is a guy by the name of Chan Robbins. If you're a birder at all, you might have had the Golden Guide to Birds. He wrote the Golden Guide to Birds, but he was definitely one of the pioneers in ornithology and in birding. But he was talking to Rachel Carson about how they didn't have monitoring schemes in place to really understand the quantitative impacts of DDT. and put in place something called the Breeding Bird Survey. And the Breeding Bird Survey is one of these examples of a remarkable citizen science project that allows us to monitor bird populations, breeding bird populations across most of the US and good parts of southern Canada, and now even into Mexico. And it's created this remarkable data set that allows us to really understand on an annual basis how species dynamics change across all these bird species. It's really remarkable. So you can see that image up there of the map, the red, bad, blue, good. And so those are trend maps of species that are declining. And this was one of the first papers that was written came out in 1989 in PNAS, Proceedings National Academy of Science, by Chan, my mentor, Russ Greenberg, friends of mine, Sam Droege and John Sauer. And it was really the first paper since the DDT thing that reported on population trends of neotropical migratory birds. And it wasn't good. It reported these massive declines in most neotrop birds. And that kicked into gear a variety of things. So in the same way that DDT did, there was another book written, Where Have All the Birds Gone? A popularized version of that PNAS paper that started the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, which I eventually led, and American Bird Conservancy, another group called Partners in Flight, a variety of conservation, activism sorts of things that really kicked into gear some movements around bird conservation. It was a really important thing. So in around 2015, it occurred to me that we needed to revisit that paper, and we needed to say, you know, are we, all these things that we did, ABC, ESA, you name the acronym, the Partners in Flight, Migratory Bird Center, are these conservation things working? Are they helping birds out there? And so we did another analysis that was eventually published, I think, in 2019. But we asked something slightly different. First of all, we did all birds in North America, and we actually came up with a methodology for actually counting total number of birds to see how many total birds have changed in North America. And what we found was not good, but we used breeding bird survey data. I've told you about that. Christmas bird count, which is another citizen science data set, and several other ways that people count birds, like ducks and other species. Did them all, did all those species. And what we found was not good. What we found was that most species are actually declining. We found that there's been a net population loss of about 3 billion birds since 1970. That's about 30% loss of abundance across North America. And 57% of species are declining across North America since 1970. It is a fire alarm, should be a fire alarm. Perfect timing. You can turn that off now. So. And the scary thing is that when I was in 1989, when I was at that, we had a meeting about that first paper that came out. One of the things that we all talked about at that meeting, which was at Woods Hole, was we have to make sure that we keep common species common. And what we found in this paper was that failed. We're starting to not only see rare species become more rare, we actually are now seeing common species change, because 50% of the loss was in 10% or 10 of the most abundant species. Species like horned lark, junco, Savannah sparrow, red-winged blackbird. In fact, blackbirds are just tanking for the most part, which is just not good. And one of the problems has been that we have not been able to, we can't follow the migrations of most of these birds on the planet. And if you can't follow, if you don't know where individuals go, this is the migratory connectivity I was telling you about before. If you don't know where they go, if you don't know where these populations spend the year, you don't know the reasons for your further decline. Everyone has always assumed, oh, it's habitat loss. And habitat loss is, and I'll talk about this, no question it's a big deal. It definitely is. But if you don't know specifically where that habitat is being lost, you don't know where to save that habitat. You don't know how to save it. And it may not be habitat loss. In fact, when you look at species that have been listed on the ESA, most of those species are listed not due to habitat loss. It's because of malaria in Hawaii. Most Hawaiian birds are endangered, like critically endangered. In fact, just in the last year, one went extinct. Or it's pesticides like DDT, or it's over harvesting. These are the sorts of reasons why most species have gotten to the ESA listing. Not entirely. And I'm not saying habitat loss isn't important, but you can't assume it's habitat loss. You can't assume that by putting in a network of protected areas that you're going to save species. In fact, what I maintain is that species are slipping through the cracks, especially migratory species that have such large areas that they traverse that are critical for their full life cycle. and certainly their full annual cycle. But the key at this point is for us to figure out what are the drivers of bird declines and what are the drivers for the most important species. So let's dig into this a little bit. So we know that habitat loss from agriculture expansion is definitely a big deal. It's happening all over the place. If you just fly across the United States, I'm just always amazed at the amount of lost habitat. You know, you see it, whether it's in urban areas or it's in areas where we are growing lots of wheat or food or soybeans or cattle grazing. That's lost habitat. It's easily a third of the United States, easily. But it's not just in the United States. It's also in, it's everywhere on the planet. But then, so that's sort of an indirect cause of mortality. We've removed that habitat. There's no place for animals to breed. There's no place for animals to survive the non-breeding season. But then there's more direct, we call it direct anthropogenic sources of mortality. And I'm going to talk about that for just a bit. And that's another thing that we can actually quantify and we can actually try to ameliorate. So one of the first is the impacts of non-native species. And this is another topic that I've spent a lot of time and energy on. And that's the impact of cats, domestic cats. I could talk about this for days. Scott Loss, my postdoc, and I and a colleague, Tom Will, decided to try to do an estimate of the total number of birds that are killed on an annual basis by cats. And it's actually not that complicated. The challenging thing is how do you count cats? Counting cats, turns out, is a really, really hard thing to do. This is coming up automatic. And so basically, but there are estimates for the number of cats, certainly for owned cats. And there's a couple different types of cats. There are owned cats, and then there are unowned cats. But even for the unowned cats, there are cats that are around human habitation that are typically part of colonies. They're fed. And then there are feral cats. And if you're a feral cat, that means you've got no connection to human, you're not dependent on humans in any way at all. In fact, 40 national parks have problems with cats. I've been a consultant for the National Park Service in invasive species for a long time, and they have problems on at least 40 national parks. Those are truly feral cats when they're in national parks. And then there's a lot of data out there, a lot of studies that have been done where they track cats and they look at the total number of birds or reptiles or butterflies or whatever it happens to be that they kill on a daily basis or an annual basis. And you can pretty much calculate the total number of birds that are killed. And we came up with an estimate of 1.3 to 4 billion birds per year. And for a mean of 2.4 billion birds, which really kind of threw people for a bit of a curve. I have received and still receive death threats for this, along with a book that I wrote called Cat Wars. It's been a big problem. And it's not just birds. They also kill on average around 12 billion mammals every year, and they kill untold numbers of insects. They're responsible for 63 species extinctions, 40 species of birds, 20 species of mammals, and 3 species of reptiles. Many of those are on islands, but they're not entirely all on islands. And they're also threatening another 400 species of declining birds right now, somewhere around the world. It's a big problem. Cats are a big problem. They are entirely carnivorous. When they're well fed, they still go out and they kill animals. And this is not the cat's fault. This is our fault. This is a human created problem. Cats are domesticated just like a bunny, not a wild bunny, but a white bunny or a cow or a horse. These are domesticated animals, but they're non-native species. They're a tremendous problem in certain states like Hawaii. They're a real great problem, but they also spread disease. They spread a variety of things like Toxoplasma gondii. I can talk about that later if you like, in detail. And then, of course, it's not good for them to be outside either, because cats get hit by cars, they get taken by coyotes. But this becomes a really interesting, on the one hand, predicament and dilemma that we've got to deal with, but a really challenging one on another, just because of the number of animal rights organizations that are focused only on cats, not thinking about the entire ecosystem that's on the other side of the coin here. And so it's created a big problem. But cats take a lot of birds out in the environment. But speaking of non-native plants or non-native species, West Nile virus was another one that came into the United States in the early 2000s, I think. 1999 it first came into the United States. probably via mosquitoes, probably via a plane. We don't really know how West Nile virus got here. It's an interesting zoonotic disease. But along with the postdoc Shannon Ledoux and a colleague, Mark Kilpatrick, we tried to look at the impact of West Nile virus on birds, because disease impacts on nature, on wildlife, has been pretty tremendous. We think that disease, in fact, things like malaria, has been a big driver of the distribution of animals over time. Certainly, a place like the Caribbean, if you look at what it's doing in Hawaii, malaria is introduced there. It's caused the extinction, changes the distribution of multiple species of Hawaiian honeycreepers, which are an endemic species to Hawaii. But here with West Nile virus, we actually saw, darn it, what's doing that? You can see we did this is what's known as a Bayesian analysis, where you look at things prior and things post. So post introduction of a particular stressor. So this is after West Nile virus came into the country. It started in the east and it spread across the entire country. And we looked at the population dynamics because we have such good monitoring data of birds. This, I think, is actually not of blue jays, which is what those birds are. I think this might be of crows. Can't remember what species this was. But we saw a really strong signal of West Nile virus, a non-native invasive disease that was brought into the United States on a whole suite of species. And still to this day, there's several species that have not responded or not come back. Blue jays have, American crows have not. There's been some changes in types of crows here. It's really interesting. And a few other species like screech owl, we think have probably been hit and knocked back pretty hard, which is very interesting. But globalization has lots of unintended consequences, one of which is we're starting to move a variety of pathogens around the planet, and those pathogens have impacts on native species, and West Nile virus is a really interesting example of that. Another thing that we have to look at is how we've changed the actual vegetative cover of the United States and other places around the planet, mainly through the horticultural industry. We have really changed how many native plants are across habitats. We really didn't understand how important native species of plants were in terms of their co-evolved pests, the insects that are grown on these plants, and how other species are dependent on those insects that co-evolved in those plants. And so we've changed the fundamental sort of energy structure of many systems. And so this was a study I did with a Ph.D. student, Desiree Narango, and Doug Talamay. Doug Talamay is a professor up at Delaware. This was a study that I ran here for 20 years called Neighborhood Nest Watch, where we would go into people's yards, and with their help, we'd catch and color band birds, and we'd look at cats, we'd look at all kinds of lead contamination, cadmium, butyrated flame retardants. We looked at a whole suite of things in people's yards with them as scientists, with our Smithsonian scientists, and birds as a big marker where we track their survivorship and do all kinds of things. But what we did in this study was we actually looked at yards that were mostly native versus a whole grading of yards that became mostly non-native, and looked at Carolina chickadees and looked at how Carolina chickadees brought in food, how much food they brought in, how many young they fledged. And what we found was that if you were a Carolina chickadee, I don't know if you can see this cursor. No, you can't. Good. At around 30%, if your yard was about 30% non-native or 70% native, you were actually producing many more young than versus non-native yards. So basically, we should be creating yards that have about 70% native plants, and that's going to turn a site that's thought of as a sink for reproduction into a source. So that's a really important sort of target that is now moving out there in terms of what we should be shooting for native species of plants in yards. But we're changing the landscape of the environment. When you see non-native plants, there's lots of reasons why you want to flip that over to a native species. So those are all examples of direct anthropogenic mortality. But what Scott and I eventually did was we sort of pulled a lot of these together where we had data. Those were individual studies. We didn't have really good data for some of those. And we wanted to sort of say, okay, we're going to target one of these, or we're going to really focus on some of these and try to sort of reduce those impacts. Which ones do we focus on? Any ideas? Yeah, so for cats, it's 2.4 billion birds per year versus buildings and windows at about 1 billion. Those are the two we would focus on. And so, but it turns out trying to get cats off the landscape is probably a lot harder than stopping climate change. And I'm not kidding. The cat thing it turned out to be such a challenging thing. The building thing has turned out to be a little bit easier, despite the fact that Glass buildings keep on popping up all over the place. And automobiles and wind turbines is the one I always get questions about. Wind turbines, it turns out, are not that big of a deal. They are for certain species, like golden eagles, and we can place them in certain places. Turns out a lot of those places also conflict with where birds like to fly. Yeah.
Can you compare the bird strikes, the wind turbines with bat strikes, or whatever happens to bats?
Yeah, so bats, I don't have the data on bats, but it is an issue for some bats in some areas. They've definitely recovered a lot more mortality with bats at wind turbines. A lot of the bats do fly at night, and some of these wind turbines can be turned off. That's the neat thing about wind turbines, as well as that during periods of movement, you can actually shut down those wind turbines. In the southern coast of Spain, near Tarifa, right on the Straits of Gibraltar there's on the Morocco side, it's just covered in wind turbines. On the Straits, on the Spanish side, there's lots of turbines, but they have people that watch these big flights of vultures and eagles and other species that come across, and they just shut down the turbines when these big flights of birds are coming over so they can minimize it. We can do the same thing here. We can modify how we use those wind turbines. You can also change the height of turbines. There's a lot of things you can do, all in an effort to become energy, in the energy transition. So it's a really important thing that we continue to try to push these sorts of things. We look at the siting that we use for these sorts of things. But relative to, sorry about that, relative to cats and relative to wind turbines, in terms of direct anthropogenic mortality, wind turbines are fine. It's really the buildings and the wind and the cats that we need to be focused on in that case. And then you throw in, a variety of other things. When you think about a migratory species that moves up and down the Western Hemisphere, it's facing multiple and interacting threats that are going to be changing its ability to survive. And then you throw in climate change, which means not just a change in temperature. For most species, it's actually the drought and the changes in precipitation regimes that are having the big impacts. Not temperature per se, but temperature can have really important impacts on phenological changes of plants as well. But these are all very, very challenging. So how do we respond to these threats? What do we do? Well, there's a variety of things we can do. One of which is start to identify which species are being impacted by what specific threats. So a few years ago, we decided that, the answer to that analysis that we did, that paper, was that most of the conservation things that we were doing were not being as effective as we needed to be. So Partners in Flight, for example, or the Migratory Bird Center, the conservation they do, American Bird Conservancy, no matter how hard they're working, something needs to change. We need to reimagine what we were doing. And so we looked at that 2019 paper as that answer, as the crisis, and we needed to come up with an answer, a new solution. So we came up with something called the Road to Recovery, which was an effort to really prioritize a group of species that were sort of racing towards ESA listing. But we didn't want them to get to ESA listing because once you're listed on ESA, that means you're closer to extinction. That means you are going to become extremely contentious because the entire ESA listing process is something that not everybody agrees with. Some people think it's horrible. I don't. I think it's critical. I think it's our only piece of legislation for species that really works for birds anyway. And so we wanted to come up with something that sort of kept birds off of there. The idea here is that we start to work on these species before they get to ESA listing. And we do it not just with the biological science, but we co-create solutions with the social science at the same time. So that's the idea, is that we created this targeted conservation, these actions for these high priority species that we call tipping point species. Identify what it is exactly that's limiting these populations. The thing that changed was this new technology that came along. We now can track birds. I showed you some of the connectivity patterns, so we can actually find out exactly where these birds are going. This is new in the past 20 years. The amount of tracking that's now happening with animals is relatively new. There's a renaissance now of sort of tracking our ability to watch animals move across the planet. And then to really integrate the social science and the biological science. So when you get to the implementation stage, you can actually make changes on the ground fairly rapidly to try to stop that limiting factor from acting. So that limiting factor is the primary thing that's causing a decline in reproductive success or impacting adult survival in some way or whatever. So this is the Road to Recovery, and we just hired Amy Gambrill, who's our new executive director of the Road to Recovery. We've got a very large group of people that are working on this. There's 112 species, believe it or not, of the say 750 that are slipping through the cracks that we would say are in need of immediate action to really pinpoint these declines. Is it habitat loss, and where? Where do we put the money? If we have the money, where do we put the money to really stop that from happening? There's a whole suite of species. It's like golden-winged warbler, evening grosbeak. Evening grosbeak's in the upper right. And that's a mountain plover and a short-billed dowitcher. All kinds of species. I'm going to go through one example. This is yellow-billed cuckoo. This is work done by Callie Stanley, who's right up here. Callie and a variety of folks. You can see the map here, all that red. These are declining populations of eastern yellow-billed cuckoos. They used to occur in the West, but they're almost extinct in most of the West. But Callie put on these satellite transmitters that hadn't really been done before to try to understand where these cuckoos were spending their non-breeding season. This was that blue is what was thought of as being the non-breeding grounds of cuckoos before. The orange is the breeding population of yellow-billed cuckoos. After we put on satellite tags on these birds, whoops, the animation didn't quite work. What Callie found out was, whoopsies, sorry about that. That blue area that is the non-breeding grounds of the cuckoo. They don't go all throughout South America. They go to an area known as the Gran Chaco. That's the primary area. They spend most of their time there. They move around a little bit. They're a very, very odd bird for lots of different reasons. Now the animation's working. You can see that the Westerns hit South America first, but the other ones catch up pretty quickly. And they all sort of concentrate, but it's only through tracking data that we can really figure out where these birds go. Well, it turns out the Gran Chaco area has been the subject of massive deforestation over the last 20 or 30 years. This is northern Paraguay, northern Argentina, southern Bolivia. And this is an area where soybean farming is huge, cattle grazing is huge. The area is just being totally decimated. A lot of indigenous people live there. Callie, do you know how many different indigenous tribes live there?
No, I don't know.
It's impressive. It is impressive. And this has been written about. And so there have been lots of articles written about this in fairly well-known papers. But still, this habitat destruction is horrible, and it's driven primarily by Mennonites. So Mennonites are doing this not just in places like the Gran Chaco, but in Belize, in Mexico, the northern areas of Mexico, where a lot of our grassland species spend the non-breeding season, are totally decimated as well, primarily from Mennonite farming. So what can we do about all these sorts of things? Well, we can do things like the Road to Recovery, which we're working very hard on, and raising money and targeting individual species. But one of the things I always hear about are, what can I do as an individual? And this is sort of one of the examples where I think there's lots of things that individuals can do to try to help this situation. So I thought I'd just share some of those. The first one, of course, is keep those goddamn cats inside. I mean, and not only that, tell your neighbors to do the same thing. And this is a very contentious thing. It's one of the reasons I titled that book Cat Wars. It's because it is the subject of wars that happen all the time. And you don't need to approach it in a really aggressive way. In fact, you shouldn't approach it in a really aggressive way. You should give them a copy of my book. That's the first thing you should do. No, but you should basically tell them, if your cat really doesn't want to go inside, make this your last cat that's outdoors. Any future cats that you have, keep them indoors. Build them a catio. You can actually create like a screened-in porch. It's actually a thing, catios. Put them on a leash. And I've actually seen more and more people walking their cats on leashes. You're not going to go out for a jog with your cat, but you can still get your cat outside where your cat will actually be stimulated. And that's the whole point. Your animal needs to be stimulated. Just like you have a dog and you throw the ball for your dog, which is what I do, or whatever. Your animal needs to be stimulated in some way, or enriched, and that's what you have to do. But just kicking open the door and letting it out is just not the answer. It's just not going to work. But the more you can spread that gospel, the better off we'll all be. And that's for owned cats. For unowned cats, it's a much more challenging thing. For unowned cats, the solution has been, from the cat advocates, something called trap, neuter, return. And the idea here is that if you catch the cats and you neuter them, you can put them back in the colony and you can just feed them and they'll be fine. Turns out it doesn't work quite that easy. Turns out in order to stop, and the idea is that they'll eventually go extinct. That population will eventually go away because they'll die out and they won't reproduce anymore. Well, it turns out in order to sort of stop population so that the growth of the population declines, you need to basically neuter between 80 to 90% of those cats. And that's almost an impossible thing to do. The other thing is these cats continue to kill birds and other animals, even when they're still living on the ecosystem right there in that spot. They continue to get diseases. They continue to die horrible, horrible, inhumane deaths. I can go over this over and over again, but I'm not going to bore you, but it is a problem. And we have solutions. Unfortunately, one of those solutions is a challenging one, and that's euthanasia. But I would argue that getting hit by a car is not a humane way to go. Euthanasia probably is a humane way to go. But there's been this massive spread of no-kill shelters across the United States that most people think are a good solution. I don't think they're a good solution because most of those shelters that hit a certain number of animals can't take anymore. And so if somebody all of a sudden has a cat or a dog and they decide, you know what, I can't handle this, and that shelter's not going to take it, I'm just going to toss it out. I'm going to abandon that animal. That's what happens. That's how abandonment happens. And it creates many, many other problems for these animals, including for the birds and native species that we're trying to protect. So that's a problem. The other thing is windows. What can you do about windows? Well, actually, there's amazing things you can do about windows. There's all kinds of striping and things you can put on windows. In fact, this building, before we moved into this building, there had been lots of surveys that had been done around here. And this building is actually not a big bird killer, but we're going to continue to do some more work on this to confirm that's the case. But we now know there's architectural designs that you can actually implement into new building construction and actually change old buildings to make them bird friendly and actually really reduce the number of kills. There was a building outside Chicago or inside Chicago called McCormick Place, right on Lake Michigan, that is known as a massive, massive bird killer. And there's curators from the Field Museum that were collecting birds there every spring and fall migration. It's like tens of thousands of birds were killed by this building. And then I think it was last year, year before last, there was a massive migration that happened. And in one night, there was, I think, 8,000 birds that were killed. I had a picture of like a big collection of birds that were in a museum. It's that sort of a thing. And a friend and I wrote an op-ed for PNAS, or National Academy, PNAS, I think it was. And that started to really kick into gear a lot of pressure from folks, including from some legislators that had written up an act on bird safe buildings. And McCormick Place changed all of its windows and is no longer a bird killer. And so you can actually do this, and you can actually modify buildings so it's safe for birds, safe for people. You can also turn lights off. So birds are attracted to lights. We now know this is also another big killer of birds. And so just by turning lights off at night, and there are some cities that have actually taken this seriously, and during periods of migration, which is basically September, October, November, or March, April, May, turn the lights off at night, save money. You also save birds. So there's ways to modify behavior that's actually quite helpful for the survival of birds. Reduce your lawn, get rid of your lawn, plant natives, just so many things that you can do in your yard. My yard is just, not surprisingly, I'm a goddamn bird guy, but put out a few feeders, I still have hummingbirds on my feeders. I let pokeweed grow up. I plant natives. There's just simple things you can do to turn your yard into an active living environment. The goal is to turn your own yard into a national park. That's what you should be thinking about if you own property and you own a yard. There's just so many things you can do to turn it into a wildlife-friendly area that's important for birds and can provide all sorts of wonderful habitat for animals because they're living amongst us. Avoid all pesticides. There's just no reason to use Roundup or any other pesticides. It's not good for you, it's not good for your pets, and it's certainly not good for native species. Roundup, for the most part, I think we've ended the use of Roundup on the hilltop, but it was happening when we first got there. And I think they now don't use Roundup, but there's just no reason to use Roundup. Gets in our water, it's just a horrible thing. And there's all sorts of problems with neonicotinoids, which are a common pesticide used in most major agricultural areas. And we now know that neonics cause all sorts of problems for birds and other species. But we're still fighting that battle because it's a common pesticide that's used all over the world. And DDT is still used in many places as well. Not in the United States, but in many other countries. Another simple thing you can do, and if you drink coffee here, you actually are drinking this coffee. It's called bird-friendly coffee, and I ran this program when I was at the Smithsonian. So coffee is a plant that is grown under canopy cover. It's how coffee was originally grown. And you can actually, we've done the research that when you have at least 30% canopy cover over coffee plants, you actually create habitat that's quite similar to native habitat. It changes, you lose some species, but it's much better than when coffee's grown in sun. Sun plants produce a lot more beans, but it doesn't produce anything for birds and other wildlife. So my mentor, my previous postdoc advisor, Russ Greenberg, came up with this whole notion, and we've just taken it and grown it and grown it, and it's still growing, and created a certification. So it's called Smithsonian Bird Friendly Habitat. And so you can go into a coffee store, or you can go into Whole Foods, Pete's, and you can actually look for that certification. And you know when you buy that coffee, not Rainforest Alliance, but for Smithsonian Bird Friendly coffee, you know that coffee's been grown in a rich habitat, in a rich canopy covered environment. Plastics. This is another easy one. We want to sort of stop putting plastics into our environment. Plastics cause all sorts of problems. And you've probably all seen these sorts of pictures of seabirds that ingest these plastics. We saw them a couple of weeks ago, probably with Rebecca. I don't know if you showed one of these classic pictures. But plastics are bad for all sorts of things, and certainly bad for seabirds and sea turtles and all sorts of things. So we just should not be using plastic. Even plastics we use here could end up in one of these marine garbage waste dumps, whatever they're called. Yeah. And watch birds. Get out and watch birds. There's so many wonderful places here to appreciate nature and appreciate birds. We went out to the Kenilworth Gardens this past Wednesday. The Botanic Gardens, the reflecting pool right here where that red phalarope still is. You could probably leave there and go see the red phalarope if you wanted to go see it. But just appreciating birds is an important thing to do, and support your legislators who actually support nature and support wildlife. It's a really important thing to do. And there's all sorts of fun ways to make it more accessible. How many of you have heard of Merlin? Merlin was created by several friends of mine. You can now go out, because when you go out bird watching, you hear birds and you also see birds. And now you can use Merlin, turn on this app which uses AI, and it identifies all bird songs. And so you can actually identify what birds are around you. But you can also use eBird and keep track of the species you see, try to see more species than your friends. And all that data is actually used to help monitor birds over time, which is a really important thing to do. And then there's other things. There's Recovering America's Wildlife Act. There's a variety of things that we have been working on to try to get into place that are pretty much not happening now, to try to get more money on the ground to save species, save habitats, reduce threats. This was sort of in the previous administration. We thought this was going to happen. Didn't happen. Certainly not going to happen now. And I don't want you to think that I'm not in favor of protecting habitats and restoring habitats. I 100% am. That just can't be our only answer and our only approach. Habitat protection absolutely has to happen. It's critical, but our job is clearly a lot harder than we thought it was before. We can't just protect habitats. We've got to do that, but we also have to look at the species that are slipping through the cracks, try to protect them as well. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was that piece of legislation I talked about earlier that Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to do with now. Well, the Trump administration in his first term actually pretty much neutered this and got rid of all sorts of the important pieces in it that was fining or punishing companies and others that were actually causing the damage to wildlife. So this has actually changed. It's really kind of a shame, but doesn't mean you can't come back. So to wrap up, I think it's clear, migratory animals, they're just remarkable. but they need protection. They live incredibly complex life cycles that has them moving beyond our borders and across other countries. So we need to make sure we're continuing to push international conversations, international cooperation to try to protect these species that are so important to us. I like to think of them as pieces of art, and we save our human heritage when we put artwork in museums. This is our natural art. This is our natural heritage. And every time I see a bird, it's like the first time I've seen it. That red phalarope, I've seen thousands and thousands of red phalaropes. But when I see a red phalarope in a reflecting pool right here, right in front of the Capitol, it represents something very, very different. First of all, it's vagrant, it's out of its habitat, which is amazing. But it does represent how international we actually all are, even if we're home in the United States, and how much of a responsibility we all have to protect these species that are all part of us and part of future generations that have the same rights as we do to be able to see a red phalarope in a reflecting pool, or a Connecticut warbler, or a cardinal in their backyard. And we're not keeping that promise to the future generations. Most of these species are declining, so the red flags are up. We need to act. We need to act now, and we're trying to. We need to incorporate, a lot of natural sciences approaches, but we have to really think about the human part of the equation, which I didn't for most of my career. In fact, most of my career wasn't about people at all. I tried to get to pristine areas where there were no people. That's what I used to spend all my time doing until I started working at the Smithsonian in 1999. I realized it's about people. And we have to think about the people part of the equation. People keep saying, well, why don't you study this about cats? Why don't you study that about cats? It's like, no, if I were to start another study on cats, it would be about why people aren't acting to stop cats. That's the question I would ask, studying the people to try to figure that out. What motivates people to act? Those are the questions we need to be acting on. I'm still going to do my biology, but. So engaging the public is really critical. I feel like we've lost our connection to nature. We've lost that ecological belonging. We lost our ability to value nature. And if you don't value nature, why would you act to protect nature? That's sort of the fundamental issue here. So repairing that connection is really where I spend a lot of my time. That's why we're doing what we're doing in the Earth Commons. That's what's so fundamental to making sure not only what we do every day matters, but what our kids do or our students do. I'll gladly take some questions.
We have time for maybe one quick question.
Really?
And then I also want to remind you that we have eco-social after this. And next week, Taylor Jones is going to be telling us about the invisible glow of croplands from space. So please make sure to come to that. Any quick questions?
2 questions.
Sure. All right. 2 questions. Sure.
I was wondering if you had a breakdown between like mortality based on owned versus unowned.
Yeah, it's about 2 to 1 for owned cat 1 to 2. Owned cats are about half as many birds killed or mammals killed to unowned cats. Unowned cats take a lot more. And yeah. Tim?
On the cats again, and maybe on the social science too.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any sense of in what locations cats are most damaging? You mentioned Hawaii. Can you specify other places where maybe a decrease in the cat population would have the biggest payoff?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so every city has, natural areas, and every city has not so natural areas. And so, in fact, in my book, we talk about this very thing. So if you're going to remove cat colonies, remove them from the natural areas. Those are the places where they typically dump cats, is in, protected, like Kenilworth Gardens. You wouldn't want to put a cat colony in Kenilworth Gardens. That is a major stopover area surrounded by urban, a lot of urban areas. So birds target those areas. You want to sort of understand where your vulnerabilities are before you spend the time to do that. So you definitely, like in national parks, that's a no-no. In Hawaii, where you've got endangered species of birds, that's a no-no. Near a colony of birds, piping plovers, that you wouldn't want to do that. There was a big fight in Long Island. They had put a big cat colony right next to a piping plover breeding colony. Piping plover is a small little shorebird that's listed, and that was a big fight. Those are the areas that you'd want to remove first. Yeah.
So when it comes to how old birds fall in this equation, obviously they're not native to North America, but they've been here for centuries and maybe more integrated into the food web. Is there any sort of movement to conserve those North American because they have a position?
Do you mean like starlings or house sparrows?
Starlings, house sparrows, exactly.
Actually, starlings and house sparrows are two species, and pigeons are not protected at all, and they're doing completely fine. So there's no move, they are actually not protected. Those are totally non-native species, and yeah, doing fine. Gina?
Yeah, getting back to rats or getting back to cats.
Yeah.
Rats and birds. There is an article just today actually about our cities being overtaken by rats.
Yeah.
A lot of folks I've worked with, specifically farmers that have chickens and have other pigs, whatever, keep cats
Yeah.
to deal with the rats.
Right, and
And so what you're thinking on that when
so cats actually do not take rats very often. So there've been two studies, two in Baltimore, that are we point to all the time. They'll take some juvenile rats, but actually cats have no impact on rat populations. They take small rodents, but the last place you want to put farm cats or cats in general are on farms, because then you increase your risk of Toxoplasma gondii exposure. And let's save that for snacks. We can, when we're having some snacks. But it's the last place you really want to have cats is on a farm where you're producing food.
so you
That's
might
really-
want to publicize that. I mean.
Oh, we
give
do.
it out.
No, we do.
Yeah.
It's publicized. Toxoplasma gondii, if you want to read a good article, it's in the Atlantic. It's called Your Cat is Making You Crazy. Or you can read chapter 4 in my book. There's a lot of evidence, lots and lots of papers on the impacts of Toxoplasma gondii, mental impacts on schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression. I mean, it goes on and on and on, not to mention in the United States and several other more developed countries, when you're pregnant, you are not supposed to change kitty litter. And now in the United States, you're also not supposed to even garden outside because of the risk of being exposed to oocysts from Toxoplasma gondii. We've known this since 1960s. And so that's because it is a significant risk. And because of what happens is you can abort your fetus. There's all sorts of other issues that can happen to the fetus. So there's all kinds of things with toxo, and we just seem to ignore it because the cat lobby is so powerful. I wish I was kidding on that, but it is so powerful.